Would you look at that, 3 months in and someone finally decided to learn how audio works. Nah, I'm just kidding, I found a better sounding preset. Over the past 2 weeks, I've been talking about the mid-bug deck that I've been bringing to my local 7-Point Highlander weeklies. When I built it, I knew it probably wasn't the optimal deck for the style I wanted to play, but it had some cards I wanted to use and it felt like something a bit different from what everyone else is doing in the space. Since then, I've had a bunch of people ask me about why I've chosen to build this particular version of the deck, why I've made certain decisions, and what I think about how the deck operates. So this week I'm going to kick off with a deep dive into what I think about mid-bug. What initially drew me to the deck was the sexiest cockroach this side of the Mississippi, and the Planeswalker that's just 6,000 bugs in a trench coat. These are some exceptionally powerful cards, which also happen to be really good against mid-range decks, which are some of the most common that I face at my local Sydney scene. Oko had just come down from 2 points to 1 as well, making him even more enticing to build around. Having played Annie's Bug Oath control deck, I knew that the colour combination had access to some really powerful interaction. The star headliner is Abrupt Decay, a card I've been enamoured with ever since I used to window shop Modern back in 2015, which also happens to very cleanly answer most of Grixis's main threats. There's also Assassin's Trophy in the same genre as a main deckable-ish removal spell, which can also hit a bunch of stuff you might want to sideboard against. Then there's Blue, which should need no introduction. I wanted to model my deck off Bus Stop Grixis, one of the decks I've liked to complain about the most since I started playing the format. It's a deck I actually really like. It's extremely skill expressive, and you get to play a lot of cool and extremely powerful cards. It just matches up really well against degenerate strategies, which is my favourite way to play Magic, and I also get matched up against some of the best pilots in the format who keep wiping the floor with me. Ever since I played Grixis Reanimator, I've had a lot of respect for the skill that goes into pulling off this sort of deck correctly. I really wanted to get experience with these cards and these strategies, which led me to creating this build. It's very heavily geared for the mid-range matchup, even including sideboard tech against it. It's a bit all over the place, I'll be real, but I knew it was going to be wonky going in. The key thing was to have some time playing with these cards and using them in this way. A lot of my time and effort over the next 2 weeks went into reflecting on my gameplay, but there are other issues here. And the main thing is when I look over the deck, it's not a green deck. Yes, all the cards that make me want to play the deck are green, but I'm not leveraging green's strengths as a colour. Let me explain. Green as a colour gets to do a few things, but the big one for mid-range is skipping ahead on mana, in particular making the jump from 1 to 3 almost seamless. Loading up on mana dorks lets you get powerful threats into play more quickly than other decks, and allows you to include a natural order package at almost no cost. This plays into a meta phenomenon I like to call the fair deck carousel. Imagine a meta where the only way to win is by playing threats and attacking. The first deck to emerge is the fastest one, the one which can deploy its damage as quickly as possible. This deck's biggest weakness is a deck that's 1 turn slower. Why is that? Well, this second deck can contest the board almost as quickly, but as the game goes on, its threats are just that bit better. With the improved card quality, it can turn the corner and close out the game against the original deck. But the second deck has the same problem, and so on and so on. But eventually there's a problem. After just a couple of steps, you stop being able to contest the board right at the start of the game, and the original aggro deck can clean you up before you're able to turn the corner. This creates a cycle where the best decks settle on the biggest threats that they can afford to play, while still being able to affect the game at the right moment. You could think of it as the aggro, mid-range, and control cycle. Mid-range tends to have a good matchup against aggro, which tends to be good against control, which tends to be good against mid-range. In the context of green mid-range matchups, the Dork Order package lets you cheat. You get to play the same quality of threats as other decks much earlier in the game, giving you an injection of pressure right off the bat. At the same time, you get to play a much higher top end with an unreasonably powerful threat that you're never actually going to pay retail for. The card quality in 3 to 4 drops, in Bug specifically, is also among the strongest cards in that category available. There is, of course, a cost. You dedicate many more slots in your deck list and in your hand to mana than other mid-range decks do. Your ability to interact gets a lot less reliable, and if your threats are dealt with, your top decks are much worse than if you just had a bunch of generally good cards in your deck. Ultimately, this is just a very different style from the deck that I wanted to practice. I was looking for the concentrated injection of the best cards Magic has to offer. A highly interactive experience with top decks like Yami Yugi himself. That's fine. After all, I started with a list of cards which fit that mold. Well, Bug shares the same 2-color core as Grixis. Some Grixis decks even splash green for access to some of the cards that I'm playing. The issue isn't so much the cards that I'm adding as the cards that I'm cutting to play them. See, without red, my whole curve shifts up. Instead of Darcy and Ragavan, I get Tarmogoyf and Leovold. Instead of Bolt and Unholy Heat, I get Assassin's Trophy and Abrupt Decay. Instead of Expressive Iteration, I get Rakshasa's Bargain. This is the other hidden cost of green. It gets to cheat on mana because it needs to cheat on mana. While it does typically beat red on the table, it needs to get there first, and there's very little that can match red's efficiency. I do get to keep some of the best 0 mana interaction in the game, and some of the best threats, but there's a hole in my plan shaped like Count Von Count, one that would typically be bridged by a mana dork. Even after I revised the deck, cutting the pieces which don't fit my game plan and smoothing out my curve, I still wasn't able to match my opponents on activity. Having cheaper cards makes multi-spelling much easier, and spending all your mana every turn is a great way to make sure that you're progressing the game. To be clear, all my cards are very good. The issue is what I've chosen to make with them. It's like painting a house with a canvas brush. Yeah, it'll technically do the job, but it'll take a lot longer and probably leave a rougher result. There are some advantages, mainly that your threats are categorically busted, but this is probably the last week that I play this build of Bug. I just prefer to play a deck that's a bit better at doing the thing that I want it to do. I'll be giving my boys a longing look through the glass, but unless there's a ridiculous upset at Can Brawl, I don't think my mana is going to be able to support the splash just yet. So with that insight, I decided to go out with my last build of Bug. This time it was Ozpost who didn't bring my Tarmogoyf, Force of Negation or Carpet of Flowers, which would have been nice to have, but didn't end up making the biggest difference. Round 1 was a familiar feeling, getting thrashed by Mardu Beats, but I was really happy with the pace of my play. In our first game, after having both my threats taken with hand attack, I chose to surveil a counterspell to the top, with neither player on the board. My opponent flashed in a failure on my end step, but I chose not to counter it, and was rewarded by hitting an Overlord the very next turn. As the game closed out, I chose not to counter a Pyrogoyf on their turn, taking 6 and going to 6. I then passed holding up a counter and removal spell, was able to clear the board with those, then untap, cling a creature, and reanimate the Goyf. This put me in a winning position, but they ripped Flage with enough mana to cast it and immediately escape it, and I didn't realize that I had the ability to cling another creature and live on 1. Game 2, after a complex turn 1 fight over Tamio, I wound up getting completely rinsed by Ketramos, whom I can't kill without Dismember. All in all, I think I played this match well. I had good patience, properly identified when to use my interaction, and made sure that I had good keeps. Mulligans, I think, are one of the most important skills in terms of both how difficult they are and how much impact they have on the game. So I'm really happy when I can look back on a week and not see any big problems in my opening hands. Round 2 was a great example of how my thought process has evolved in this way. I drew a 7-card hand with 5 lands, Brainstorm and Spell Snare. It's tempting to keep because I have a fetch land, but I realized that either I Brainstorm turn 1 and only get to shuffle away 1 card, or I have to hold up Brainstorm and Spell Snare on turn 2. Either way, it's a really low tempo hand, and one that I'm not happy keeping. The 5 I did keep wound up sticking a frog early and getting some cards out of it, which really helped me to stay in the game. My opponent then sniped my 3rd land with Oppo, It was something I really should have seen coming. They played a land and a 1-drop and a Lotus Petal, and then just passed. I didn't need to fetch then, and Oppo is a card that I consistently fail to play around. As a consequence, I was stuck on 2 mana for most of this game, but fortunately my opponent was flooding. I stuck Zeke and turned him into a 4/4, and was able to hit over and over again until eventually he became the Abyss, eating my opponent's creatures one at a time until eventually they couldn't keep it back any longer. I lost game 2 to a big misplay. See, I had Grist and Zeke, and I'd made an insect token, but my opponent had Felia and a Barragoyf to attack with. I forgot that Zeke could make an extra blocker as Felia blinked the token to get rid of it, and as a consequence, wound up losing Grist. There was more game to play, but I didn't pull it back. Game 3 I kicked off strong, with Duress taking their Animate dead and an on-curve Baz hitting an incredible mill, putting Uro into the bin and Tasigur into my hand. My opponent had a Ketramos, but I opted to switch it on by reanimating Uro. Mate, did he earn his keep this game. Ketramos could never attack since Uro kept crashing in, and even though he had lifelink, the card advantage was just insurmountable. Eventually, I was able to snipe their Skyclave Apparition with Zeke to deal with Ketramos, exactly 1 turn before I drew my Dismember. Liliana's defeat took out their Baz, and after an entire month of playing Bug, I won my first match. In round 3, I went up against an old flame, 8-point goblins. My opponent was on a Rakdos build with a Soul Ring over Mana Crypt to play a wider spread of 1-point cards. Game 1 was close. I had a big board with Barragoyf gaining me a ton of life, and my opponent had to do some pretty creative things with Pashlik Mons triggers to avoid letting Leovold draw me too many cards. But with General Crete in the mix, no amount of cards was able to stop me going down to the Storm of Pings. In Game 2, I was able to stabilize the board and get in some damage with Baz and Grist, clearing the way with Cry of the Carnarium. My opponent, however, had a Skull Clamp but was not afraid to use it, drawing into Urza Saga and pumping out construct tokens which were 6/6s off of, well, basically their entire point spread. I made a mistake here, being overprotective of my Frog instead of using Grist to trade it off for a construct token. I had Metamorphosis Fanatic in my hand, which was a much better threat, especially since it gets back Barragoyf, and the Frog itself was just a 2/3, neither really attacking nor blocking. Ultimately, my opponent drew into Kiki Jiki, copied a construct, and finished me off. This was the first time I've played against a deck that I have any real familiarity with, and it was a really interesting experience. It made target selection and sideboarding much easier, and I was able to play around specific lines much more effectively than I have with other opponents. I mean, clearly it wasn't enough, but it was an interesting experience, because I haven't played enough of the format to know other people's decks this well. Plus, their build has some neat changes that I really want to try out at some point. My opponent in round 4 described our match as a slobber knocker, and I don't think I could have put it better myself. I've had more coherent experiences translated from Russian by a mystical rat who speaks only in riddles, and those who have seen the glory of Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits have a glimpse of what went on. I start with Tamiyo and Bauble on the draw, cracking on their upkeep and seeing Orcish Bowmasters. They cast it on my upkeep, targeting Tamiyo with both triggers. I swing in for a clue, possibly a misplay, and pass back without casting my Ponder since they can kill the Tamiyo before it flips. They cast Breaches, and since I don't have an answer, I cast Leovold instead. Now, every time I draw, they get the option to target me or my stuff, and I get the option to draw again. They wisely opt not to do that and target their Orc army token with their next trigger instead. I pass back and my opponent casts Wheel and Deal, a card that nobody has ever heard of, but is a back-breaking play. My opponent targets Leovold with 3 triggers, me with 4. I opt not to draw extra cards with Leovold, but Tamiyo flips, becoming unable to block, and they crack in with a 10/10. I'm dead. Game 2, I'm on the play. I keep this hand, play my fetch, and pass. My opponent does the same, and I crack in their end step to go and get a Surveil land. They respond, cracking for a shock. And they announce that they're putting a spell on the stack. Stifle. My heart drops, but it's okay, I have the misstep. My opponent, still searching their library, announces that they'd like to cast Daze, bouncing the yet unfound watery grave that they're fetching. My heart drops again, but alright, well, we have the force. We've just burned 5 cards between us over a single land drop, but it resolves. I am allowed to have mana this game. I surveil Zeke into the bin and draw a land, which lets me cast Tasiga on turn 2. He's able to get them all the way down to 4 before he's dealt with, but they start hitting back and milling me with an Ashiok. Eventually I have to fetch into the Ashiok just to Fatal Push their Kitesail Larcenist, and it's 4 plays 5, I have 14 cards in my library. But Leovold resolves. I hit them down to 1, and they go for the Hail Mary, wheel and deal, targeting me. I counter it, and we go to game 3. I kick off with a Deathrite Shaman, who immediately cacks it, and we start trading resources back and forth. I've got just 2 lands in play, and only Worldly Tutor and Dismember in hand, so I go for the end step Miracle Max. It's not the biggest Miracle Max anyone's ever seen, and the Deathrite Shaman I get back dies again immediately, but they don't have an out to max, and I'm able to win my 2nd match in the month. This was a really refreshing week to have. I felt way more confident in my decision making, particularly mulligans and interaction timing. I did wind up taking some turns off to cast removal instead of threats, but these were deliberate decisions which even my opponents acknowledged had a huge impact swinging the game into my favour. Yes, I still wound up getting crushed a few times, but I can see myself playing more confidently, using my threats to assert myself on the game state and actually playing with a board. As for the deck, I'm sorry I ever doubted Miracle Max. I've gone from not even putting him in the deck to tutoring up specifically to be a 2-mana 4/4 with lifelink. As for Uro, he also earned his keep, despite the number of times that I've seen him go down to the incidental graveyard hate that's all over the format. The deck feels sweet, and it's been a blast to play and learn this more skill-intensive playstyle. It's something I want to be practicing with a lot, especially leading up to Canberra, where I'll want to be as good as I can with the deck that I end up bringing, which hopefully should be a good deck. I'll be back next week with something the same but different. Until then, good luck, have fun, and may the best wizard win.